I'm an archaeologist, and I'm based at Hopkins on the Homewood campus in the classics department. And my particular research focus kind of spans from ancient Greece, from the time period around 1600 BCE to about 1100 BCE for the Minoan era. But in kind of my broader research, it goes all the way back to about 3000 BCE, and then forward into the Iron Age. So this course is part of this sort of innovative new format for teaching that the classics department at Hopkins has developed, and it's called the Classics Research Labs. And the idea is that students in particular areas of the humanities, and obviously our interest is in kind of classics-based studies, have the opportunity to sort of join a researcher, a professor, a PI, in a large-scale research project from, I was going to say the ground up, and it can be from the initial moment when research sort of begins, but more the ground up in the sense that the students actually participate in the gathering and kind of formation of the research itself, of kind of the basic meat of the research. Years ago, I taught a course at the Peabody in the humanities department on cultural heritage. And it was during that time that I became aware that the Peabody Institute, when it was sort of its initial conception, was a very kind of pioneering cultural center in Baltimore, but really in the United States, and that it equally sort of involved the conservatory, the library, a lecture series, and an art gallery. And it was in the process of talking about the Parthenon marbles and their display in the early British Museum that I came across an image of what's now Griswold Hall at the Peabody, but then was known as the North Gallery, that contained this incredible collection of plaster casts of classical sculpture. And I remember in that course in the Peabody, right across the hall from Griswold Hall, I showed the image, this beautiful black and white photo of what was the Peabody North Gallery filled with these sculptural bodies. And I asked the students to consider, where was this? And they guessed everything from the British Museum to the Louvre, whatnot. And then finally, this organist said, "Is that Griswold Hall?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." And in Griswold Hall, as you know, there are still vestiges of this cast collection because elements of the Parthenon frieze, casts of it, surround the top of the wall. So those have stayed in place. And I started doing more research on the history of this cast gallery. And that was years ago, but I knew then that I wanted to turn this into a larger research project. So what we know is that the North Gallery was sort of the heart, if you will, of the art gallery of the early version of the Peabody Institute. And in 1879, John Wirt Garrett, who was the president of the B&O Railroad, gifted sort of this commissioning of just under 100 plaster casts of sort of, I always describe as sort of the greatest hits of classical sculpture. And this was a really incredible process where a sculptor who was from the Baltimore area originally, Henry Reinhardt, but was based in Rome at the time, oversaw the production of these plaster casts, from the original sculptures within various different museums in Europe. And then part of what my kind of research group, this lab, has worked on over the last 2 semesters is tracing how these plaster casts come from, the Louvre and the Vatican and the British Museum, their travels on steamships through the Atlantic. In some cases, they came in initially to other ports in the U.S., but make their way to Baltimore. And then what happened with them in the city as they then become sort of the core element of the Peabody Institute's art gallery. So I knew kind of the broad outlines of this, but the work we started doing in the fall was sort of a deep dive. And this is when the archives have been, as you know, absolutely critical to this research. And so there were a number of microfilm reels that had been made with the Smithsonian, with a program on American art by the Smithsonian in the 1970s, to try to essentially record these great collections of American art. And they had taken a number of archives with the help of the archivist Elizabeth Schaaf, who was at the Peabody at the time, and created these microfilms, which contain just incredibly rich material from photographs, historical photographs, to newspaper clippings, annual reports. Among the other items are handwritten ledgers recording the kind of movements and development of this plaster cast gallery. So we have the receipts written in France, for example. We have the names of the steamships, the insurance receipts. And a lot of what we've been interested in is trying to get at the very kind of human element of all of this. So part of the work we've been doing is looking at, for example, the people who probably had the most contact with the casts in the Peabody Gallery. And that's a number of women who were gallery attendants and also a janitor who we now know worked at the Peabody for 30 years. His son took over after him. He was Antonio Comella was his name. He was an immigrant from Italy. And we're really gaining more texture in terms of not just this collection of classical sculptural casts, but of the way that they fit into the Peabody, that kind of microcosm, if you will, but also how that was very much embedded with changes that are happening in the city in this crucial moment after the Civil War, when Baltimore's negotiating its identity. And this project fits within a larger research project that I'm working on that really looks at the media, kind of diverse media through which people in Baltimore from a period of, roughly 1850 to about 1950, how they're engaging with the ancient world and specifically with ancient Greece. So what's the actual kind of substance of how people are thinking about and seeing and, even touching these ideas of the ancient world and ancient material. And the cast gallery is a huge part of that. But we're also looking at the fact that Baltimore is a very diverse city already then, and a lot of people did not have access to resources like the Peabody Cast Gallery. So we've looked a lot at the history of public education in Baltimore, at how that kind of public education changes throughout the course of the 19th century, how African-American education began essentially as a kind of purely led by African-American innovators and educators. And then 1867, the city takes over. But looking at the curricula, looking at references to the Peabody and going to the Peabody to look at the cast galleries, for example, how that was incorporated into school curricula, but also how were other people engaging with the ancient world if they didn't have access to these types of resources. And so we start to see the Peabody in this collection, this incredible collection of casts, in a much wider field that tells a story about sort of, if you will, ancient Greece in Baltimore at this time and how that changes as we kind of move from the Gilded Age into the Jazz Age, and it changes really considerably. And the Peabody Cast Gallery sort of marks the early element of this. And then it develops with also developments in archaeology, in the way that replicas are being created and attitudes towards replicas. Plaster casts were very kind of wondrous things when they are being produced already centuries earlier throughout Europe, when this, we know about casting already from the ancient world, but there's this moment in Europe where all of a sudden this starts to be a way that the kind of rich and powerful can bring the exact surface. I mean, the casts are made on the surface of these ancient sculptures, can kind of control and command them, being moved and possessing them, in their galleries all across Europe. And when the United States is first kind of forming, there were no ancient sculptures to speak of. I mean, no ancient European, Western sculptures. And so when we start having cast collections like the Peabodys arrive in the US, this is sort of it. I mean, this is somehow that these incredible sculptures, and with it, this whole idea of Western heritage becomes actually manifest here. They also were some of the early forms or kind of ways for models of the human body, because live models did not fit so well with the kind of Puritan ethos of the early US. So there are 11 students. And like I said, it sort of began in the fall, but is extended through the spring. And they take this as a course at Hopkins. But I can say without any hesitation that this has been one of the most rewarding teaching experiences I've ever had. I mean, the students are deeply invested in this project. And I think part of it is the format of these labs, but I think part of it is also this is their home city. And everything that we find out about the people and the places and these elements of the culture of Baltimore feels very much like it has a connection to them. So they have spent, I don't even know how many hours, but going through thousands of pages of archival material. We've been looking at everything from, like I said, sort of the ancestry of the people that we know worked at the Peabody Gallery, to records of public transportation, how they changed in the city. So we can imagine people kind of it's a way of getting at who could have actually accessed the Peabody Gallery. For whom was that a practical possibility? We've looked at studying the few photographs we have in terms of being able to reconstruct the layout of the cast gallery, which is actually very significant because these cast galleries were something that were kind of an established prized resource at the time around the kind of the late 19th century when the Peabody Cast Gallery was formed. But they could be arranged in different ways. And one of the things that's interested me for years is the idea of walking into these cast galleries. And, not unlike what happens when you walk into the ancient section of a museum today, you have material kind of condensed in a single space that's from radically different time periods. So we think of the, quote unquote, classical world, but we're talking about really different moments, places, social context throughout Greece and Rome. And all of a sudden we have, when somebody walks into something like the Peabody Cast Gallery, all of these bodies arranged. And part of what plays out is not just the individual specimens. Could you see a particular sculpture, the Venus de Milo, for example? But what kind of juxtapositions does that layout create? And the Peabody layout seems to have been somewhat idiosyncratic. So part of the work of this lab, kind of the crown, if you will, is a walkable virtual exhibit where we try to take what evidence we have for the original layout of the cast gallery. And I'm working with a group in Berlin to recreate the North Gallery as it existed at the end of the 19th century. And then we're sort of populating that with 3D models of all of these sculptures. And so the way that a visitor to this virtual exhibit can kind of move through, our hope is that that kind of recreates the experience. And again, these juxtapositions. And that has been somewhat complicated by COVID, but not insurmountably. So one thing that is key to keep in mind is that cast galleries broadly sort of went out of favor as we kind of see the turn to the 20th century, and with that an opening, among other things, of access to ancient sculpture, the original ancient sculptures in the US. So museums start to be able to acquire, these originals. And we see casts kind of in limbo in terms of whether or not they are essentially kind of tools for art education, or whether or not they are sort of held to be objects of art in their own right. And this plays out differently with kind of different attitudes at different times. But as we get into the 20th century, attitudes towards classical culture, kind of as such, also change. And the casts and what they represented also became politicized. So we have really interesting stories, for example, of them being sledgehammered. And what we know quite clearly is that the casts at various points throughout the 20th century went to other locations in Baltimore. We know that a group of them quite early on went to what's now MICA. At the time was the Maryland Institute for the Promotion of Mechanical Arts, and a group of them are still there today. We know that some of them went to public schools that were opening. We've recreated, we think that's around 1925. There's been some really excellent research that has also preceded what we've done that we have been able to work with to help recreate that. And then there's sort of vague indications that they've gone other places around Baltimore. So one was found one was in the basement of Evergreen House, which is now part of Johns Hopkins, as well as is the Peabody. It ended up in the classics department at Hopkins, and somebody asked me what this was. So I started doing some research, and it just coincided with the time when I started working on this project. And I contacted, somebody who's been incredible for us, Chris Kensel, who is the associate curator and collections manager at the Maryland State Archives. And he's been, just a key figure in documenting the lives of these casts from the point when they were sold to the state of Maryland. So eventually the entire remnants of the Peabody art collection were sold to the state of Maryland. And so I contacted him and said, we have this bust of Asclepius. And we were able to confirm that it was part of the Peabody collection that Garrett had commissioned. So they're out there in some cases. Some of them, sadly, like casts all around the United States, have been destroyed because they take up a lot of space. So if they're not on display, where could they be? But I'm very hopeful that we'll still find some more. We were originally going to spend parts of the fall and spring 3D scanning, kind of searching throughout Baltimore and scanning them with a 3D scanner. COVID threw a wrench in that, but one of the benefits of these cast collections being greatest hits is that they existed elsewhere in the world. And Europe continued to sort of prize these collections after they went out of style in a lot of, at least in many places in the US. And so they have created, in some cases, 3D kind of documents of the cast that they have. And so we're able to draw on those as we create our virtual exhibit, not only because we have, a 3D scan of a particular sculpture, but in some cases, we have a 3D scan of a plaster cast of a particular sculpture that was made by the same cast producer as our own casts were. So we're getting very close to it. And that the exhibit part of it will be this gallery that you can walk through. And, that type of information on an individual piece will be available to somebody if you kind of click on it. But that also is embedded, as I said, with kind of the broader research project in a really kind of careful study of what Baltimore at this time looked like, and sort of how the Peabody Cast Gallery is one crucial piece within a larger story of how people in urban spaces in the United States, and Baltimore in particular, were engaging with and imagining and kind of recreating the ancient Greek world at this time. And it's pretty spectacular how that was happening. Well, the microfilms, like I said, were created as a way of trying to document art collections that were significant in the United States by the Smithsonian. And I've been deeply impressed with the extent of materials that they did put in these microfilms. However, there's some material that at least we strongly suspect, but that we also can tell from the kind of document file locator names and descriptions that are available and kind of summaries that would not have been put in the microfilms. So I think we are interested in, like I was saying, sort of filling in is one dimension of it, of sort of, okay, we've got from the microfilms this really, really rich sense of the administration of the Peabody Art Gallery. And by administration, I mean from, the Board of Trustees and the decisions that they're making. Obviously, the actual purchasing of the casts, we know, where the casts came when they were broken, when they got off the steamship in Baltimore, where they went. We have addresses on stationery, for, to be repaired. Who was putting kind of protective coatings on them. Which cabinet makers were making the pedestals, which are another kind of incredible element. So we have this really fascinating sense already from the microfilms. But one thing, for example, I'm really interested in is whether or not we might find a guest book, essentially. So if you walk into the North Gallery, did you sign your name somewhere? And it's the type of thing which, with archival work, you can happen upon that is not something the Smithsonian would necessarily be interested in scanning. But we have really interesting information about sort of who was allowed in, who was not, kind of side complaints about, what's happening. So little kids aren't allowed in, not only at the Peabody, but now I'm thinking of other art cast collections. People would, there was actually vandalism of the cast. And again, to go back to the idea of these bodies, which I think seem so familiar culturally to us, the idea of like the perfectly white classical sculpture, that these were again, something that could be both wondrous, like truly considered wonderful, that you had this means of taking the crevices of ancient sculpture that had come out of the ground, thousands of miles away, and that all of a sudden it could be made present in Baltimore in this kind of new space was wonderful. But then, that with time, it also developed other dimensions. So this kind of interest in classical culture was considered conservative and backward looking at times. And so, breaking one of these casts could be a political act. And so, that's one dimension. But also, like I said, there's sort of a different attitudes towards, especially the nude bodies that we see with these sculptures in North America. And so some of the vandalism is because they were considered dangerous because they're showing a human body. And that was considered, wrong in some way. So, pouring through the archives themselves will help to give us some of that sense. If we can find a guest book with names, then we start being able to say, these people who were kind of almost like a diaspora, right, of throughout the city, of places and people and connections, they were there. And that's kind of points of contact. And that's when we start being able to recreate or imagine the scope of impact that these types of things could have. Not like, if you walked in and saw these Peabody cast galleries, we understand that as sort of defining everything you do thereafter. No, but this would have been one really incredible means through which the ancient was conceived by people at this time. And for different people, that was playing out in very different ways. So, we have, if you think of where the ancient world would have been sort of manifest for people, the cast gallery is something really particular to Baltimore. Theater is another area. Schooling, church. The ancient world of the Near East and Egypt was also coming to life at this time through archaeological work, but also in terms of, for example, think of the illustrations that you come across in different types of religious texts. And those are books, that have, a certain circulation. We know from one of our students has been working on public education, and she's come across and has really gone through very carefully guides that were put out by the city, including about arts education. And so what types of objects were they saying that an art classroom in Baltimore City schools should have on display? What posters, essentially, what models, if you have it in one way. So you start to be able to really create this context of sort of what people were seeing. And that's the actual stuff of what the ancient world was for people at this time. This was not a time where you went on to Google and put in Parthenon and pulled up something about the Parthenon and whatnot. So we have to think in different ways and from a different mindset. We've had a lot of really incredible support from people throughout on the research level throughout, especially Baltimore. I mean, just incredible, from Micah to people who are focused on kind of researching public education and the history of African-American education in the city, to legal dimensions of kind of the city's development, et cetera. Really great work we did with sort of trying to look at the history of George Peabody and Frederick Douglass, who both their time in the city overlapped. Peabody becoming, one of the richest men in America at the same time that Frederick Douglass is here as an enslaved person. Both in their own way, sort of crucial to the story, or at least crucial exemplars of sort of how ancient culture was viewed as significant. Douglass buys a secondhand copy of the Columbian Orator, this reader that has classical oratory in it, down 10th Street in Fells Point. And that, he tells us, is, a crucial element to his formation as a thinker and as a speaker. And so, that object was really crucial. And that kind of, what he fought for and kind of forged this connection is very distinct from what Peabody is kind of contributing to down the road a few decades in terms of founding the Cass Gallery, when he kind of gives back to Baltimore that he had been part of. Really wanted to think about the Peabody's position in Mount Vernon, but also as much as we could about the Institute, as in not just a place of kind of white privilege. How do we think about that more broadly, whether it be the fact that we have to realize that it is a place of white privilege, which is true in many ways, that, it has a history of sort of connecting to some of the richest people in the United States at this time. But how can we then look in places that might be less expected to try to see, how the archives and how the material from the art gallery could help us formulate paths to getting at other people's experiences. And one unexpected way that happened was looking at the catalogs of the Cass Gallery and noticing these, the lines of kind of the people involved, and as also in the trustees' annual reports, and seeing these attendance of the gallery. You're seeing the same names year after year. Then every once in a while, there's a little shift. A new name will appear, but also the janitor. And that research has taken off since we've been able to look at, it was from that kind of insight from the archival material that now we have a much more robust sense of who these figures were. Some of them are not only kind of have an immigration background, but again, to kind of draw on this Antonio Comella, he's born in Italy and comes here, and he lives, at the Peabody, essentially in Peabody Alley. And for 30 years, he works there. So he's so much a fiber of it. And this is someone who doesn't show up, with the Board of Trustees and with, Peabody himself and with John Wirt Garrett, who's the president of the B&O Railroad, or thinking about the relationships, with the Walters and other figures. But they're there. It's been much more challenging um, to try to kind of access the African American stories, but harder because we had to look in places that we didn't necessarily. There wasn't not an immediate path that we might think of. But there's robust histories and so much incredible research and historical, but also connecting that to now that's happening in Baltimore in that light. So I would say both in terms of what the archives have done for us and in terms of these collaborations throughout the city. Um, I would just say it's been amazing. It's been a really incredible experience. It's very much still taking form.